Hi, welcome. We're just going to let folks join the room and then we'll get started. So maybe about 1 more minute as you all start joining. Thanks for being with us. All right. Looks like we've slowed down on our entries into the room. So welcome. I'm Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library. Thank you all for being with us this evening. I want to welcome you to our second event in a series of events we're holding in conjunction with our exhibit, Visualizing Capital Punishment, Spectacle, Shame, and Sympathy, curated by my colleague KB Beck and the Historical and Special Collections team. We are delighted to welcome Professor Carol Steiker, the Henry J. Friendly Professor of Law and the Dean Special Advisor for Public Service, here to serve as our moderator in our conversation tonight. Professor Steiker is the former faculty co-director of the Harvard Criminal Justice Policy Program. She writes, speaks, and teaches in the broad field of criminal justice with a special focus on capital punishment. And I also want to extend a warm welcome back to our panel of alumni who are working in the area of death penalty defense. And Carol, I will turn it over to you. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn, and thank you, KB, for curating this terrific exhibit and putting together such a great year-long series of events. So for those of you watching, there will be, I think this is the last event of the fall semester, but there will be several more events in the spring. And I join Jocelyn in thanking these 6 wonderful HLS alums who are joining us tonight and who are doing this important and challenging work. So instead of me, Seriatim, introducing them, I'm going to ask them to go around and introduce each other, not introduce each other, introduce themselves. And the order, I don't know if everyone sees it in the same way that I do, but here's the order that I see is Mike, and then Nora, and then Julianne, and then Megan, and then Jules, and then William. So in asking you to introduce yourselves, can you say when you graduated from HLS, where you're working now, and where you worked before, if this is not the first job that you've had, and what it is you, just in a few sentences, that you do in your job. So Mike, you want to kick us off?
Thank you. So I'm Mike Admirand. I graduated in 2010. I started my career and spent the first half of it at the Capital Appeals Project in New Orleans, where I represented people who were on death row in Louisiana or serving life without parole there. And then after a couple of short stints at some other offices, I've landed at the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta. I've been here for about 4.5 years. At SCHR, I represent people who are on death row in Georgia and Alabama. And then we also have this other practice of resentencing and individual advocacy cases where hopefully we're able to get the client resentenced and released. So, and that's across 3 states.
Great, Nora.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nora, she, her. I graduated just a minute ago in 2021. And after graduating, I went to the Federal Public Defender's Office in Montgomery, Alabama, and was at their capital habeas unit. And I feel a little sneaky because I actually just left and am now clerking, so I'm not doing this work right now, but was doing it the last year. And I was a research and writing attorney there, representing people both in their federal habeas appeals and then assisting local attorneys in Alabama. There's no guaranteed right to post-conviction counsel in capital cases, absurdly. And so was also working with state counsel on state habeas cases. And I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico now.
Julianne.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julianne Hill. I graduated in 2015. I am the Deputy Director of the Powell Project. We are a small organization that does capital trial consulting work. So we work with capital trial teams in about 8 states, and we provide resources and assistance in whatever way we can to help avoid new death sentences at the trial level. I've been with this organization since 2016, and the year immediately following graduation, I was a legal fellow at Reprieve, which is a human rights organization that is based in London and New York. And there I was working on things related more to lethal injection.
Great. Megan?
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan. I graduated in 2019. I am currently at the Federal Public Defender's Office in Phoenix, Arizona, where I represent death sentence individuals in their federal habeas proceedings. And prior to that, I had a 2-year fellowship with Justice 360, which is a nonprofit organization in South Carolina, where we represented death sentence individuals in both state and federal habeas proceedings, as well as taking on a select few juvenile life without parole sentences.
Great. Jules?
Hi, I'm Jules. I was in the class of 2020 at HLS, and I'm a research and writing attorney at the Federal Community Defenders in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. So that's in Philly. Our work here is actually nationwide. It's a CHU that works across the entire country. So my clients are in Texas and Tennessee and Arizona, and of course, Pennsylvania. Prior to being a research and writing attorney, I was actually on a fellowship through PSVF at the same organization. I was also an intern here through the Capital Punishment Clinic. So thank you, Professor Steiker, for sort of jumpstarting my career. And right after law school, I was clerking in the DC Superior Court.
Great. William?
Hi, I'm William Ahey. I also am with the Powell Project, and I graduated in 2017. I joined the Powell Project just a year ago, and prior to that, I was a public defender in El Paso, Texas.
Great. Well, you guys bring a wealth of experience and different kinds of experience doing capital defense work to this panel, which is great. I think what students might be interested to know is, when you came to HLS, what did you think you were going to do? And how did you end up doing capital defense work if that wasn't what you came to do initially? So I'm not going to call on anyone, although I might if nobody raises their hand. This is my classroom policy, but I'm sure you will be happy to volunteer. Does anyone want to jump in? And you can just leap in, this be a free for all, and think about that question, which someone I bet hasn't been asked for a while.
I can go first. I came knowing I wanted to do public defense work because of some experience I had in college working for the Shelby County Public Defender's Office. I worked in their juvenile unit there, where they had kind of just started implementing a holistic defense program. And I was supposed to be doing some statistical analysis on their conviction rates, and kind of ended up working as a mitigation specialist assistant. Came to absolutely love that type of work. Completely changed my life plan, decided to go to law school and become a public defender. And then while here at Harvard, I developed a relationship with Professor Umuna, who really recommended that I consider death penalty work as a way to fulfill both my kind of legal interests and wanting to do appellate focused work, but also really be able to develop that relationship with clients and be able to provide a holistic defense.
Great. Anyone else have any thoughts about that? Want to share their journey?
I can. I went to law school. I mean, it was not a very well thought out plan, I'll admit, even though it's worked out well. This sort of wanting to be a civil rights lawyer, but not really knowing what that means. It was pretty amorphous. And but one thing I knew is, I'm from Connecticut, and I went to Harvard for law school, and I went to undergrad in New England as well. And I wanted to do something different. And the public interest advisor at the time was Alexa, just really kind of encouraged me to try this out and go to the law practice of a man named Rob McDuff, who was in Jackson, Mississippi. And because she said, this is great experience. It'll just be you and one other clerk, and you'll get a wide array of experiences. And she was right. I mean, I worked on civil cases, criminal cases, trials, appeals, federal, state, but the one that really grabbed me and that took up the most time that summer was a pretrial capital case from the Mississippi Delta, and it was, truthfully, the first time I had really wrestled with the death penalty and really sort of put any thought into who is it that we're putting on death row, and how does this match the narrative that we're only getting the worst of the worst, and that kind of put me on this path towards where I am now.
Anyone else?
I will say I entered law school with a very different plan. I thought maybe I would focus on climate justice or farm worker rights. That changed pretty quickly through my involvement in PLAP, and that was really what launched me on a different trajectory. And then I became very focused on public defense, and very confident that that's what I wanted to start off in at the very least, get some trial work in. And I actually wasn't aware of anything like the Powell Project doing pretrial capital work, and in particular doing consulting with defense teams. And I think it was largely my work at the El Paso County Public Defender's Office and kind of getting to experience firsthand the struggles there and just what it's like to be in an under-resourced office and feel like you don't have all the support that you need to offer your clients the best and what they deserve. So being able to assist defense teams that are kind of experiencing the same thing is really a dream come true. So this has been an ideal spot for me after that.
Great. So, here's a question. I'm just going to move on to another question, but you can feel free to go back to an earlier question if you think of something you want to say that addresses an earlier question. But I'm sure something that many students who are listening now would like to know is, how did you find your job? How did you find out about it? How did you apply for it? How did you get it? So anyone who wants, or it doesn't have to be your current job, it could be an earlier job too, because many of you have done more than one thing. So anyone want to share some thoughts about that?
I can share. Oh, I saw Julianne unmuted. Having recently gone through this, I can share a little bit. And I'm someone who I applied for regular jobs and I did the fellowship process. And so if anyone listening would like to talk about having recently gone through either, I'd be happy to talk anytime. I was really interested in Montgomery, Alabama as a place to live. I had some friends who had lived there. And so before my 3L year, just sort of started calling people or cold emailing people who did interesting work in Montgomery. And people in this work tend to be really kind and want other people to be doing the work. And 100% of people responded to me and were willing to chat. And I was actually mostly looking for placements for fellowships at the time, and went through a fellowship process. But through the fellowship process, decided to just apply for some regular jobs. And I was someone who had a clerkship 1 year out, and so I had 1 year, which is kind of a funny position to be in, and never thought anyone would hire me for 1 year. But actually the CHU in Montgomery had some flexibility, and especially in terms of their research and writing positions, was something I learned, and was able to take me on just for a year with healthcare and all the normal benefits of an employee, which was an amazing opportunity. But I think the message for me was that really reaching out to people, even without connections, was incredibly helpful, both in terms of connecting and also getting a sense of what the options are, because capital work can look so many different ways at so many different places.
I agree with Nora. I also did the fellowship route, and I knew that I had wanted to do capital punishment work by the time I was looking at fellowships my 3L year. And so I was really focused on trying to figure out how I wanted to do that work and where I could potentially do that work as a first year lawyer. And so I reached out to trial offices that had dedicated capital units. I reached out to capital habeas units, and I found offices that were willing to take on fellows. And ultimately ended up choosing Reprieve, where I did my fellowship, because they have basically a project which helps foreign nationals facing the death penalty in the US. And I thought that that would be really interesting because I would get some exposure to both trial level cases as well as cases on appeal or in the habeas process. And I really wasn't quite sure what level I would be interested in working on long term. I just didn't have enough experience. So I ended up taking a fellowship and ultimately got this job through a connection that I met while I had that job. So certainly kind of your professional networks matter a lot as you kind of continue in your career.
And I can jump in and give a little bit of my story as well. So like I said, I had an externship at the Philly Chew. And once I was there, I was sort of single-mindedly like, I am coming back here and no one will stop me. So after my clerkship, I was able to get a fellowship there as well. And they hired me out of the fellowship into my position. And I guess it also dovetails on the prior question of what brought us to the work. I really wanted to work with people who were incarcerated, and I didn't know exactly in what capacity, whether it was going to be like all civil rights litigation or conditions of confinement work. But being at the Philly Chew in particular, their client-centered model, I just thought was phenomenal. The relationships that they had with all of the folks that we work with, it's just like very heartwarming to me. And after I saw that, I was like, game over.
Great.
I just want to add to that connecting with people that you've worked with previously and asking them to send around postings on the habeas listserv can be very helpful. Capital offices are not always the best at putting those postings on their website or circulating them to law schools, especially because a lot of them will require like 1 to 3 years experiences, 3 to 5, but often will hire people with less experience, especially if you're coming from Carol Steiger's clinic and have a lot of experience through your externships or internships over the summer. So don't be afraid to reach out, talk to people, ask them to circulate those postings that might not be publicly available, and don't be afraid to apply to something that you might not be perfectly qualified for. You never know when these federal defender offices are hiring sometimes 2 or 3 people from one posting and might be willing to take on a slightly younger person if they already have kind of that experience in the other candidates.
All right, well, happy to have more on that topic, but in a related vein, if someone who's listening thinks, wow, what these folks are doing sounds really cool, what should I do while I'm in law school to prepare myself, to make myself an attractive candidate for one of these jobs? So what should I do, in school? Courses, clinics, obviously take the capital punishment clinic, but beyond, that, or how does that fit into a plan? Do you have to do that? If that doesn't fit into your schedule? And what should people think about doing during their summers? In other words, Jules, you're someone who did like your externship, your fellowship, we're all the same. Some students say, should I do the same thing and go deeper? Or should I try to do something that's state habeas or federal habeas, or try to do something that's trial and then, appellate or habeas? Is there, can you give some advice about someone who wants to be you down the road? How should they make use of their time at Harvard Law School and over the summers to do that?
Well, I'll just say quickly that my 1L and my 2L summers were completely unrelated, not in the criminal legal field at all. It was all civil rights related and direct legal services. So while taking the clinic and having a focus is great, I think you can have a more varied experience and see what feels right.
Yeah, I think as long as you're working in a space where you're interacting directly with clients and providing direct client services, even if it's housing or something that isn't even in the criminal field, I think that's going to be significantly more important than making sure you're doing like both federal and state habeas. I think that's going to serve you so well in your practice. And also don't overlook the independent clinical option at Harvard. If you're not able to get into Professor Stryker's clinic, or even in addition to doing that, I was able to do that. They provided a travel stipend for me to go back for an evidentiary hearing for one of my clients, and being able to have a continuation from summer through the fall in independent clinic to Professor Stryker's clinic, I think allowed me to develop my practice and my knowledge with a singular office for a year so much more. And it's a great way to supplement if you couldn't get that 1L or 2L experience in a capital office, maybe try to set something up in the fall through an independent clinic.
Good advice.
I completely agree. I think that the clinics where you have direct client contact and where you're directly representing clients is really important. Capital work is very client-centered, and so demonstrating that you are interested in client-centered work is definitely an important aspect, I think, of what you should do in law school. I also think that to the extent that you can take the capital punishment clinic or an independent externship that is capital specific, you should absolutely do so. My understanding, having been out for a few years now, is that it is still very competitive to get jobs in the capital field, like as a young lawyer. And so I think to the extent that you can demonstrate that you have had that interest, even if you just found it in your 2L or 3L year, that's great. But being able to demonstrate that you have a specific interest in that field, I think goes a long way in setting you apart.
I think two things that I agree with all of that, and two things that stuck out to me in going through the process is to give some thought about what stage in the capital process you're interested in. Trial work and appellate work feel and are incredibly different, and there's space in law school to get a bit of both. Also, I think all capital offices are incredibly busy, but some have more capacity to supervise than others. And it's always hard to work without supervision when you're a new attorney or a law student, but I think that's particularly true with capital work. And so thinking about a place that has the capacity to do that. And then I goes without saying, but I don't think I could have done my job the past year without having taken the capital punishment class. I literally had my exam outline on my desk all year and used it. And so in just like a really concrete, substantive way, that made a huge difference for me.
I think, I didn't do much capital work when I was in law school. And I perhaps had a less linear path getting here, but I do think just doing what interests you and what you're passionate about is really important too. Even if it isn't something that seems directly related to a particular place you want to be down the line. When you are interviewing for jobs, applying for jobs, being able to convey your passion and your care about your clients, I think goes very far and is just going to make it a much more enjoyable experience along the way.
I really echo what's been said before, especially about taking whatever clinics you can, and in particular the capital punishment one. But I also think having some, if you can, some geographic flexibility is important. Just thinking about the folks who are on this panel were in Alabama/New Mexico or Arizona and South Carolina, and Julian's in Florida, I think, or you were at some point. And this is not the traditional like I-95 corridor of places that a lot of law students think they're going to end up in. And but I think that with it comes a lot of opportunity. if you're willing to push yourself and maybe go outside your comfort zone if you happen to be from the hotspots of where a lot of students are from.
So great advice. So, you know, maybe this, I should have led with this before sort of saying how to become you, but like, why would anyone want to be you? So I was, you know, hoping you might share like, what is satisfying about this work? Maybe even like a concrete, like high point, you know, that you've experienced in your work. I know, Mike, I like brought you back to my class to talk about one particular high point, which is very unusual moment of winning a capital clemency proceeding. But, you know, it could be that, it could be something like less obviously victorious, but just something that speaks to the intrinsic rewards of doing this kind of work. Because let's face it, it's not the same kind of rewards that, you know, many people think they go to law school for, which is remuneration, power, and glory. But, you know, obviously, as Julianne said, it's actually not easy to get these jobs. People want them. Why? What is satisfying about the work?
Just want to start by saying nobody should want to be me. I just want to have that clear on the record. But I think what's satisfying about the work, the win that Professor Steiker referenced was obviously a tremendously satisfying outcome for a number of reasons. But it was also, in a lot of ways, the low point of, or it followed the low point of the career too, having, we had just lost the client's last appeal and having to sit with him and tell him that, you know, we still had one more iron in the fire, but that it wasn't looking great. And you know, thankfully for him, you know, he's still alive and doing very well. But it just, you lose a lot doing this work, especially given the trajectory of where the Supreme Court is taking things. So I think finding, what I've always said and what one of my mentors said is you have to define victory very broadly. And so even when, you know, there was a direct appeal that I just lost a few weeks ago, and that's like an obvious loss, I don't want to sugarcoat it. But if I think about, you know, how the client was when we first got on the case versus how he is now, when he was being forcibly medicated and he had lost 150 pounds over the span of about 6 weeks or something, and now he wanted to waive his appeals, and now he's on a much more stable path, really excited to keep fighting despite the loss. Like, you know, that's a really remarkable change. And even as we're about to pass his case off to another office for his next round of appeals, I view that as kind of a victory, because now he and his family have kind of regained their communication. I think that's going to help sustain him as he tries to fight for relief. So I think defining victory broadly and in more personal terms has been really important for me.
To echo what Mike said, I think that being able to show up to for your clients, for your client's family, and explain to them that sometimes, you know, the battles that we're going to win are not going to be on the legal front necessarily. We were able to file or put together a really great clemency petition for one of our clients in South Carolina that involved some defense-initiated victim outreach that went incredibly well. I think resulted in a lot of healing for the victims and their family, for our client and his family. We got family support that we really hadn't seen before. We got institutional support from some former wardens, and to kind of see that outpouring of love and reconciliation for our client, even though he knew that clemency chances are pretty slim in that state. And thankfully we were able to defeat the warrant on a different issue, so we didn't end up needing to file it. But just going through that process with the client was so much more fulfilling for him than the legal issue that we ended up winning on. He's like, that doesn't, it's like, I'm glad we won, but that's not what means something to me. What means something to me is the process that we went through clemency. And I think, like Mike said, kind of defining these victories really broadly and understanding that our job as attorneys is not always just the law, but a lot more related to the human aspect of our job.
Yeah, I totally second and reflect all of that. For me, the energy comes from two places. One being, I think, similar to what Megan and Mike have talked about, this relationship building with our clients and sort of treating people who have been so dehumanized by this terrible system with love and compassion and humanity. And like, that feels good every single day. And that's awesome. A second piece is just being able to make it as difficult for the state to do this evil thing as possible. I'm on the lethal injection specialized team, so we're sort of bring lethal injection litigation in various states where we have clients. And we had a recent victory in Tennessee where, through all of the discovery we were able to do, just dogging them, turned up just that their process was unbelievably uncoordinated, to the point where the governor, who's a conservative guy on all fronts, was so appalled that he halted executions in Tennessee for an internal review process. And that felt like a major success.
I think for me, actually, I very much agree with kind of Jules' 2 points. In the trial consulting work, we often kind of work directly with clients when they are making really difficult decisions about whether to go to trial or whether to take a plea, or at other like really kind of specific points in the case. We've worked with people who want to volunteer for the death penalty before, or who are thinking about going pro se. And so kind of getting to sit with clients at what is, I mean, just truly the most stressful and anxiety-ridden point of their life, and helping them make really difficult decisions is something that, I mean, it's an incredible opportunity. And there are not a lot of people that I think get that opportunity to really make those connections with their clients. And then also just getting to stay in touch with your clients, because you build such deep relationships with them over the life of the capital course. And so hearing from your clients and getting calls and letters about people who are doing well in prison afterwards is always something that's really rewarding. But the other thing that kind of like makes me really love this job and the trial work is that like the legal aspect of it is really fun sometimes. Particularly in capital trial work, you are encouraged to be creative and litigate everything. Capital law is always changing, and so there is always so much to just push back on, and particularly at the trial level, I mean, you can just pick anything that seems unfair and write a motion about it. And so making it, just like what Jules said, making it as difficult as possible for the state to execute your client. And it really is kind of amazing, actually, how fun that can feel sometimes. It's fun to win. So we don't win a lot, but it's fun to win by, you know, persuading the prosecutor that maybe it's actually not worth all of this work to continue seeking the death penalty in this case. And, you know, we can all think about a resolution short of a capital trial.
My experience is obviously very short, but I had in my 1 year, I lost everything. Like my first client was executed, like nothing legally worked. And it was totally wrenching. And I think I also, to Mike's point, don't think I'd understood beforehand how much just thinking about a client's well-being and quality of life and getting enmeshed in their life, which you really do, especially when you're investigating as well, was sustaining and nourishing even when so much was heartbreaking. So I found one of my clients who had no legal calls in 5 years. I found his childhood girlfriend in Carthage, Mississippi. And they were able to start talking every Saturday for 15 minutes. And it felt like, it's hard to describe how good that felt. And I think you could probably also interpret that story as, in tough conditions, little things can feel really big, but I think it matters. And it was really affirming to know that things like fighting can feel good, the work can feel good, even when it doesn't necessarily feel like it's legally working.
Love that story, Nora. Thanks for sharing that. Well, here's a different kind of question. So you guys are all working, pretty close to the ground. You're working with individual clients and individual cases, whether they're pre-trial or whether they're, at trial or on appeal or post-conviction. But, having that micro view and being on the ground also gives you kind of an opportunity to see what's happening, where things are going. And so, I would love to hear you guys, your reflections on what you think the big issues are in terms of capital punishment and capital defense today, whether it's legal issues, what are the big legal issues coming down the road? What do we make of this moment where the US Supreme Court is clearly, which, kind of gave us a lot of stuff to work with from earlier times, but it's clearly not a place that's, doing that now. So just a thought about stepping, going, meta a little bit, getting a little bit more of a bird's eye view. What do you think? You could say, press sugar, that's your job. That's what you get paid for. But I'm just, I don't get a chance to sit with 6 capital defense lawyers very often and ask this question. So I'd love to hear what you think.
I think something we noticed in South Carolina, there hadn't been an execution since 2011. And then all of a sudden they started issuing just like a flurry of warrants, one after another. And I think people were very surprised. Well, I was surprised by their surprise, but people would come up to me and they say, like, I had no idea we even had the death penalty in South Carolina. And they not only didn't even know that we had it, they also were so shocked and horrified to find out that the state was trying to execute people using, an electric chair from the 1920s and bring back the firing squad. And the fact that people just seem very removed from the reality of the death penalty. And I think we can sometimes forget that because it's our every single day, and we probably have spent years learning about it or thinking about it even before we started practicing law. And I think something that's very important is that we're pushing kind of in our social lives, our friends and our family, and making sure that they're really understanding, like, this is happening in your state. This is something that is very real, even if executions are maybe paused in certain jurisdictions, there's moratoriums or whatever, like, this is actively occurring and it's horrifying. And the backlash in South Carolina, I think, surprised the state significantly when details of what they were trying to do really came out in a lot of very conservative newspapers with a very negative spin, not just the cost of it, which we generally see in conservative states is kind of gaining a little bit of a toehold, but the actual methods themselves were viewed as very barbaric. And conservative lawmakers they were like, we should think about this a little bit, kind of like Jules, you were talking about with the Tennessee governor. And I think that if there are more, it's hardly a light bulb moment, but there are more public advocacy around it, people would be significantly more opposed to it. And so something that I try to do more in my, private life is force people to think about this. So I'm super fun at parties, but I know it's uncomfortable, but I do think that that's important.
I think one sort of, I kind of alluded to this before, one issue that I think is going to change the game is the Supreme Court's, all but, turning off the valve for federal habeas relief. And I think that one result of that it will be that there are, or at least should be, probably more resources put towards the work that William and Julianne are doing about pretrial cases. Just make sure that they never get on the tracks in the first place, a lot more of the cases that my office is doing are in state direct appeal or state post-conviction procedures, where that's pretty soon that's going to be the main avenues for getting someone off death row who's already there. I also wonder, and this is kind of a half-baked idea because I'm at a conference right now on the second look opportunities. And it strikes me that there has been a lot, not enough, but a lot more use of executive clemency and commutation powers, coming out of COVID, or people just realizing that we have too many people in prison for too long. And so in Louisiana and Oregon and some other states, there has been a bit more robust use of it. And I wonder if any of that will translate over to death penalty commutations or clemencies where that's available in states.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Mike. I mean, one thing, here's like the professor speaking now. Prior to Furman and Gregg, there was actually a fair amount of clemency in capital cases. There was a lot more death sentencing. There was also a lot more clemency. And yet, but in the modern era, post-1976, post-Gregg, huge decline in the use of executive clemency. And some people sort of say, like, by beefing up the judicial process, as the Supreme Court did, it made governors less willing to gainsay it, sort of say, you got a problem, take it to the courts. That's not really our table anymore. So it's an interesting, and that's been true. I mean, you look at the curve, it's just a big dive post 1976 and executive clemency, with that one big spike for Governor George Ryan in Illinois in 2001, whenever that was, when he cleared out death row for that state. So it's an interesting question. You're right that there's been a lot of compassionate release during COVID. So a kind of, rediscovery of those muscles. Wonder if that will make a difference. Could that make a difference it wasn't ginned up for capital cases, but it could have some meaning there. Interesting. Any other thoughts? So that's just thought I'd put a little texture on that one. Any other thoughts?
Well, one thing that I'm hearing a lot of in my office is brainstorming on how we as a federal defender office can get into state court. So, trying to be extremely creative about appointments, which works in some places and does not work in other places. Like basically in Pennsylvania, we've figured out a mechanism by which we can represent folks in state post-conviction proceedings, even as federal defenders. We've had less success in more conservative states, but that's something that we're kind of actively thinking about.
Interesting. So connecting to Mike's point about how if you're going to get off a death row, it's most likely to be through state either direct appeal or state post-conviction processes.
Yeah, exactly. And a direct response to, the Shin ruling and everything.
That's Shin versus Ramirez, guys, for who in the class right now. I just talked about that on Friday. So excellent. Any other thoughts?
I'm not sure how much further this will go, but it seems to me that sort of the one area the Supreme Court isn't completely hostile is the intersection of religious liberties and people who are under warrant. come up a lot in Alabama recently. And I wonder if they've totally reached, they've gone as far as they're willing to go. And my understanding is that it also doesn't end up really saving lives that often, just buying time. But I'm interested to see if there's more there, or if we're sort of at capacity and what they're willing to allow in terms of accommodating religious preferences and rights at an execution.
Yeah, very interesting question. I mean, it is the one area in which this court has shown some interest in expanding rights or preserving them at any rate. So that's an interesting question. You know, we don't have that much time left, so maybe we should pivot to the Q&A. I do see it. We have some questions for you from attendees. So if it's okay, I'm just going to read the questions out and see if, you know, what your advice might be. So one question that I'm sure is question one person put in the Q&A, but I'm sure it's a question that more than one current student has. And the question is it possible for 1Ls or 2Ls with big law history to pivot to this kind of work? Whether that's what they did in their summers, or whether that's what they, you know, their first job out of law school, which is what it is for, you know, substantial number of law students. What do you think? Do you see that? And if not, would you have advice for how to make that happen? If someone wanted to make, because none of you did that. What do you think? Anyone have advice for a 1L or a 2L with a big law background who might want to pivot to this kind of work?
I think it's definitely possible, especially it sounds like the person asking maybe has big law experience from maybe their first summer. Even if both of your summers were at big law, I think if you can explain that, you know, this is something that you came upon later in law school and realized that you were interested in, and then you pursued opportunities related to this work while you were still in law school, that you are not going to be kind of cut out of the process just because you didn't realize that you had an interest in this until later on in law school. I don't think anyone here came into law school knowing that they wanted to do capital work based on all of the stories from earlier. And so I certainly think that it's possible to make that pivot.
I will
You
say
know-
oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say the people with prior big law experience in my federal defender's office do skew significantly older. They came with a significant amount of big law experience, and also, I think very critically, a significant amount of pro bono experience at their big law office, where they took on a lot of capital clients through their big law firm. I think that's when they developed their passion for it, and then left their big law office and came to the federal defender's office. So certainly, I think that kind of transition happens, I think, fairly frequently. There's several attorneys I know in my federal defender office and other defender offices across the nation that make that transition. I don't know though if after 2 years at a big law firm, the opportunities are what are available. That's just not in my area, but as much as they are, I would take those to really, again, as Julianne said, just demonstrate your interest in doing this type of work.
Yeah, and I will say that big law firms do a fair amount of pro bono, especially as Nora pointed out in Alabama, which is the one state that really doesn't step up with post-conviction representation. So there's a lot of, big law involvement in Alabama cases. So that's just, if you go to a law firm, or if you're at a law firm and they're not currently doing capital defense work, maybe suggest it. So that's just a thought. So I have a question. There's some graduate students on the Zoom who knew, and they have a question about, like, if they're planning to go to law school, is there work that you can do before law school? I think that clearly is, because a lot of my law students worked in capital defense organizations. Although I do have to say that a lot of the students who work in capital defense organizations between college and law school and then take my class then say to me, now I understand what they were talking about at the office I worked at, because it might be a little hard to understand it if you're not a lawyer. What do you guys think about that? what would you say to an undergrad who's looking to do something for a year or two before law school, but they're interested in this? What kind of thing might you suggest to them?
I think being an investigator is a incredibly interesting job where you're gonna learn a ton and meet a million interesting people. And especially if you have geographic diversity, there are positions doing that all over the country. And I think you can get a real taste of what mitigation is, which is going to be enormously, in my experience, you do a lot of investigation as a capital defense attorney. And so trying that and seeing if it's something you want to keep doing would be enormously helpful. And even if you learned from it, you didn't want to continue doing it, I think it's an incredible job that involves so many human aspects and legal aspects as well.
I had a friend who did exactly that route. She's now in law school and preparing to start her career as a public defender, and later transition into capital work. I would also really recommend trying to either get an internship at a nonprofit. Like my organization, we hired undergrads for interns. They were working on more of our like data-driven side and less on like our actual legal work. But if you can also work with an undergrad professor that's writing about issues in the criminal justice system, can help them on that, you can kind of get an exposure to that. I don't think it has to be direct client services necessarily, but just a way to expose yourself to the issues, the terminology, and gain an understanding. I think that can help you a lot in kind of narrowing down your focus when you get to law school. And I interned at the public defender's office in college doing a similar thing on like a data project and ended up being a mitigation specialist essentially. So there's lots of opportunities out there. You just have to be a little creative.
We just have a couple minutes left, and I'm going to turn it over to Jocelyn Kennedy in a minute to wrap us up, but I'm going to give my panelists a last opportunity to say anything that we haven't touched on or any last words of wisdom or advice you want to share. Can I ask you, maybe it's unfair to ask you as part of the webinar, but I will say that I will ask after the webinar is over for the contact information of our panelists, those who are willing to take one-on-one questions from law students who might, benefit from the same generosity that Nora experienced when she was looking for work. Nora has already volunteered to pay it forward, but I will ask the others if they will as well, so that you could, if you have a more particular question, that you'll have a resource to ask. So I think we're going to wrap it up now. Jocelyn or KB, do you want to come back on and wrap us up?
Yeah, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm holding you up in my heart and holding your clients gently in my heart as well. I'm really can't express my own personal gratitude for the work that you do every day. I also want to thank our audience for being here and their interest in examining capital punishment a little bit more closely from the sort of attorney side of the house. And I hope that we'll see you in 2023, as Professor Steiker alluded to earlier, for our next 3 events. In March, we'll have an in-person conversation with Professor Minow and scholars on ethical and socio-political aspects of capital punishment. Another in-person fireside chat with Professor Steiker and scholars sort of on the state of capital punishment in the US today, particularly and the history of it after Furman versus Georgia. And then in April, we'll have an ideas salon where we'll be featuring students who are in the capital punishment clinic now, who will be discussing the work that they've been doing. And I also invite all of you to please stop by the library when you're in Cambridge or visit our website. My colleague KB dropped the link in the chat, so you can see our really beautiful, amazing exhibit depicting images of capital punishment, and inviting you all to think a little bit more critically and closely about what capital punishment means today and through history. So thank you all again. I really appreciate it. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thanks, everybody. Good night.